Hey guys, tonight we wander into the shadowed cobblestone streets of a medieval town square, where the clatter of wooden carts and the chatter of townsfolk mingle with the occasional cry of someone unfortunate enough to have drawn the town's attention. You probably won't survive imagining the nervous tension hanging in the air as a man is dragged toward a pillory or a woman is ushered to the ducking stool. But here we are, and trust me, it's all part of the charm. If your idea of charm includes discomfort and mild terror. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and leave a note in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what's the local time? It's fascinating to consider our little bubble of medieval horror from the comfort of your modern bedroom. The town square is the stage, and everyone is a reluctant actor. The wooden beams of the pillory glint in the sun, nails slightly rusted but still sturdy, and nearby a simple notice board bears names of those who failed in various minor offenses, from petty theft to speaking out of turn. Historians still debate whether public shaming was designed primarily to correct behavior or to entertain the masses. But walking among the crowds, you get the sense it was a little of both. The chatter is punctuated by the occasional sob or grunt, the smell of unwashed bodies mingling with fresh bread from the market, creating a sensory tapestry that's both chaotic and oddly ritualistic. Quirky details make this scene almost surreal. Some accounts suggest that townspeople would bring vegetables to throw at offenders, reserving rotten ones for the truly detested, while others brought coins as offerings to soften the humiliation. An early form of community negotiation that historians still argue was widespread or merely anecdotal embellishment. You trudge closer to the pillory, noticing how children peek from behind stalls, fascinated, learning early that misbehavior carries weight. Adults whisper warnings or gossip, the human tendency to narrate misfortune alive and thriving. Even the architecture participates. Narrow alleys force onlookers to funnel past, concentrating attention like a spotlight, while the stone surfaces echo shouts and clatters, amplifying every noise. You probably won't survive considering how intentionally these spaces were designed to maximize humiliation without even a hint of modern stagecraft. And yet, amid the tension, there's a rhythm, a communal understanding that this theater of punishment serves the greater social order. You imagine the wooden stocks, the raised platform, the careful positioning of offenders' hands and head. Each movement is deliberate, observed, and sometimes exaggerated for maximum effect. Historians still debate whether the actors, guards, clerks, and town officials performed with genuine belief in morality or simple adherence to routine. But either way, the spectacle is palpable. You notice a small bucket nearby, not just for sanitation, but also as a subtle tool of demeaning ritual, a reminder that even necessities could reinforce shame. The townsfolk's reactions vary. Some watch with rapt attention, others with quiet dread, while a few whisper quietly to each other, speculating about the offender's misdeeds. You probably won't survive picturing how layered these observations are, how every expression, gesture, and sound contributes to the communal lesson. And yet, even as the offender wriggles or cries, there's an undercurrent of empathy, sometimes fleeting, sometimes enduring, as people recognize shared human frailty. Across the square, market sellers continue their work, balancing commerce and observation. You probably won't survive imagining the merchants tossing glances at the punished while measuring their goods and counting coins. But this duality reflects medieval life, discipline interwoven seamlessly with survival. Scholars still argue whether the economic bustle mitigated the psychological impact of punishment or heightened it through constant reminder. By the time you step back and take in the scene fully, the towering church nearby, the timbered houses surrounding the square, the mix of smells, sounds, and colors, you understand that this introduction to peculiar punishments is not just about pain or humiliation. It's about the choreography of social control, the sensory and emotional layering designed to teach, to warn, and to unify the community through shared spectacle. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of this interplay without a flicker of fascination, a shiver of awe, and a quiet respect for the meticulous social engineering embedded in what might first appear as mere cruelty. You trudge past the pillory and stocks, your footsteps echoing against the cobblestones as you notice the meticulous care with which townsfolk engage with these instruments of public discipline. Stocks and pillories weren't merely punishment devices. They were the medieval town's stage props for morality plays performed daily, often with the entire community as audience. Mainstream historical records tell us that a person could be left in the stocks for hours or sometimes days, exposed to wind, rain, or even the occasional misfired tomato hurled by an amused onlooker. You probably won't survive picturing the daily choreography of humiliation, yet there's an odd rhythm to it. Like a dance everyone knows the steps to, even if no one admits it aloud. The pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, is the classic image etched in our collective imagination. Yet lesser-known variants existed. The jugs, iron collars attached to walls, sometimes with bells, alerting neighbors to the presence of a transgressor. Some chroniclers claim that in certain towns, the victim might even be tied atop a donkey and paraded through the marketplace, a quirky visual that must have made for both spectacle and digestive concern for anyone with an appreciation for medieval humor. Historians still argue whether these additional embellishments were widespread or the stuff of exaggeration, amplified by local gossip and chroniclers' flair for the dramatic. Imagine the sensory overload, the smell of the crowd mixed with unwashed woolen garments, the heat of the sun baking the offender's shoulders, and the constant jabber of curious onlookers. Children peek through wooden fences or dangle from window ledges, learning the unspoken lesson that stepping out of line could bring both pain and public mockery. Meanwhile, merchants continue weighing goods and shouting prices, seemingly indifferent to the spectacle. A juxtaposition of ordinary life and ritualized punishment. You probably won't survive appreciating how deeply the town's daily rhythm intertwined with public correction, blurring the lines between social spectacle and justice. Fringe details add layers of curiosity. Some towns practice symbolic humiliation, leaving offenders in stocks with a paper crown labeled "Fool," or a painted sign detailing their minor infraction. Others claim that the duration of one's punishment could depend on crowd reaction, a sort of early social scoring system, though historians still debate the reliability of such anecdotal accounts. You notice a guard perched nearby, clipboard in hand. Well, a medieval equivalent, a subtle reminder that the town hierarchy monitored not just the offender, but the audience's engagement, ensuring that everyone participated in reinforcing societal norms. The community's involvement can feel almost participatory. Imagine townsfolk tossing apples or stones, not lethal, mind you, just enough to sting and amuse. Sometimes sympathetic neighbors might soften the blow by tossing coins or whispering comforting words. You probably won't survive reflecting on this curious interplay of empathy, cruelty, and ritualized control. Yet it's precisely this interweaving that gave public humiliation its enduring psychological power. Even the design of the devices matters. Stocks are elevated to catch the eye, angles chosen so that passers-by naturally pause and witness, while pillories are set in sunlit areas to maximize discomfort. You can almost feel the slight ache in your wrists, the heat on your neck, the embarrassment seeping through every fiber. Historians still argue whether the design was primarily functional or consciously theatrical, meant to instill awe and caution as much as to punish. And then there's the afterlife of the punishment. A person might leave with bruises, a story, and an altered social standing. The experience becomes a cautionary tale, retold in hushed tones or chuckled over in marketplaces. Children internalize these lessons subtly. Adults reinforce social norms, and the offender carries both stigma and instruction into their daily life. You probably won't survive appreciating how the stocks and pillories shaped behavior and societal cohesion while maintaining a certain dark humor. But that duality defines medieval justice, part instruction, part theater, part cruel entertainment. By the time you finally step back, observing the worn timber, the iron fittings, and the carefully orchestrated human choreography, you understand that these devices were not merely instruments of punishment. They were integral to the social fabric, blending deterrence, public morality, and communal participation into a complex sensory and psychological experience, one that continues to fascinate and unsettle modern observers alike. You wander deeper into the square, past the stocks and pillory, and your attention shifts to a curious contraption, the ducking stool. Historically, this device was often reserved for women accused of gossiping too aggressively, scolding their husbands, or, in some cases, suspected witchcraft. You probably won't survive imagining the tension as a woman is strapped into the chair, her feet dangling above the murky river or pond below, while the operator leans back, preparing for the slow, deliberate dunk. Mainstream accounts describe the dunk as both humiliating and mildly terrifying, a public spectacle designed to teach obedience. Yet sometimes the woman emerged from the water with a defiant glare, unbroken in spirit. Historians still debate whether ducking stools were as common as the legal texts suggest, or if many reports were amplified by rumor and moralistic storytelling. The stool itself is a marvel of functional cruelty, a wooden chair attached to a long beam pivoting over water, You notice the faint grooves where rope or chains kept the sitter restrained, and you probably won't survive picturing how the operator, often a town officer or a grinning local man, balanced the tension between control and the anticipation of audience reaction. Fringe accounts tell of townsfolk timing the dunk with bells or drums, almost like a macabre musical accompaniment, and some claimed that mischievous children would splash water back at the victim, adding layers of chaotic participation. You trudge closer and hear the hushed whispers of the crowd, imagining the conversations. She told her husband off again. Or did you hear she cursed old Marjorie last week? The charges were often minor, yet the punishment was public and theatrical. Historians still argue whether these measures were primarily gendered tools of social control, or if they were symbolic acts meant to enforce community standards regardless of sex. You probably won't survive noticing how nuanced the social messaging was. Every dunk, every squeal, every shiver transmitted moral lessons, not just to the punished, but to the audience. Quirky details pepper the narrative. Some sources suggest that the ducking stool could be rigged to rotate victims multiple times, ensuring maximum wetting and humiliation, while others note that towns sometimes employed substitutes, straw figures, for instance, when the accused resisted, though this practice is debated among scholars. You imagine the tension in the operator's stance, feet braced against cobbles, arms pulling a lever, balancing power and rhythm, a reminder of how every mechanical element contributed to the social theater. The sensory experience is vivid. The cold splash of water, the acrid scent of mud, the slap of cloth against skin, the collective gasp of spectators. Children cling to railings, learning early that public shaming carries social consequences, while elders nod knowingly, remembering their own narrow escapes from the town's moral gaze. You probably won't survive picturing the paradox of cruelty and education coexisting so seamlessly. Yet that is exactly how medieval justice operated: performative, didactic, and emotionally charged. Even the aftermath carries significance. The woman climbs back onto dry land, water dripping from her sleeves and hair, sometimes shaking with anger, sometimes with laughter, but always marked socially. Her humiliation becomes a story retold at market stalls, over ale in taverns, a cautionary tale blended with community gossip. Historians still debate whether the social scar outweighed the physical discomfort, but you can sense that both were integral to the punishment's function. Walking away, you reflect on the layered purpose of the ducking stool: a tool of control, a stage prop, a sensory experience, and a communal lesson rolled into one. You probably won't survive considering how cleverly this simple device manipulated water, fear, social pressure, and humor to maintain order in the medieval town. Yet it leaves you with an appreciation for the complex interplay of spectacle, punishment, and moral education. You meander past the ducking stool and notice a grim yet fascinating sight: the cucking stool, a variant of public humiliation often used for disorderly women, dishonest tradespeople, or boisterous neighbors. Mainstream historical sources describe it as a chair mounted on wheels, dragged through the streets while the victim sat, exposed, sometimes pelted with rotten vegetables or mud, You probably won't survive picturing the slow, humiliating parade, the victim's cheeks burning from embarrassment and occasional splashes, while townsfolk jeer, chuckle, or shake their heads in solemn moral judgment. Historians still argue whether the cucking stool was primarily a punitive tool or also a communal ritual, blending justice and theater into one. The chair itself was an engineering oddity. Its wheels allowed the operator to navigate cobblestones and narrow alleys, making every turn of the street part of the performance. Fringe accounts suggest that in some towns, water was added to the punishment, turning the cucking stool into a mobile dunking device. Imagine the mix of indignation and surprise as the victim jostles over uneven ground, occasionally losing balance but remaining bound, an unwilling actor in a human drama directed by civic law. You probably won't survive thinking about how much medieval life depended on these public spectacles to maintain social order while satisfying the audience's appetite for drama. Children cluster along the sidewalks, pointing and whispering, perhaps learning the first lessons in social conformity. Adults nod knowingly, some with a wry smile, recalling their own brushes with minor infractions. You notice a few spectators sneaking coins or bread to the unfortunate individual, acts of small rebellion against the public ritual, adding texture to the moral lesson. Historians still debate whether these acts of charity were widespread or simply anecdotal, yet they hint at the nuanced human interactions surrounding punishment. Sensory detail is unavoidable. The squeak of the wheels on cobbles, the slap of splashed water, the stink of mud and waste, and the murmur of judgment from the crowd. You probably won't survive imagining how these details imprinted themselves on both victim and audience, teaching obedience, humility, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior through repeated exposure. The cucking stool often left marks beyond physical discomfort. Social scars lingered, gossip and ridicule weaving into the victim's daily life. Scholars still argue whether the emotional impact outweighed the physical ordeal, but the intertwined nature of shame and instruction is undeniable. Fringe sources even hint at rewards for endurance, such as reintegration into social circles after a period of penance, though how often this occurred remains unclear. By the time you step away, the scene lingers in your mind: a chair, wheels, a reluctant participant, and a crowd fully engaged in enforcing norms. You probably won't survive fully grasping how the cucking stool operated on multiple levels: mechanical, social, and psychological, turning a simple act of punishment into a multi-dimensional lesson in medieval civics, humor, and human resilience. You wander further into the town square, past the echoes of public humiliation, and encounter the whipping post. The air is thick with tension, the kind that presses on your chest as you imagine standing there, back exposed, as a corded lash arcs through the air. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that whipping was a common corporal punishment, reserved for theft, blasphemy, or minor criminal offenses. You probably won't survive picturing the precise choreography of the executioner, timing each lash to maximize both pain and instruction, while the town gathers silently or murmurs in approval. Historians still argue whether whipping was intended more as a physical correction or as a tool of psychological and social control. The post itself is simple yet intimidating. A sturdy timber, sometimes reinforced with iron, often centrally located to maximize visibility. Fringe reports claim that in some regions, whipped offenders were placed atop barrels to elevate them, ensuring the lashes landed with more force. You can feel the cool stone beneath your feet, smell the faint scent of rope and leather, and hear the subtle creak of the post under strain, imagining the rhythm of punishment in the morning sun. Spectators' reactions vary. Children avert their eyes yet linger close enough to witness, learning social boundaries, while adults exchange knowing nods or whisper conjecture about the offender's fate. Some historians suggest the audience played a subtle role in reinforcing authority, while others argue the spectacle was primarily a demonstration of judicial power. You probably won't survive reflecting on how collective attention magnified the punishment's effect, shaping behavior not just for the punished, but for the entire town. Quirky anecdotes add color. Records indicate that in certain festivals, whipping was integrated into rituals, almost like a rite of passage or public penance, with colored ribbons or markings indicating the severity of the offense. Fringe sources debate whether these practices were symbolic embellishments or genuine judicial custom. You imagine the odd mixture of fear and amusement circulating through the crowd as the whipping served as both deterrent and spectacle. Even the aftermath is instructive. Bruises fade, but social memory endures. The offender might carry a literal mark of shame, yet the town's collective conscience also absorbs the lesson. Crime, no matter how minor, carries visible consequences. Historians still argue whether these enduring social impressions had a stronger deterrent effect than the physical punishment itself. You probably won't survive imagining how deeply such public correction imprinted itself onto medieval consciousness, leaving both victim and observer altered. A living lesson in obedience and communal morality. By the time you step back, the whipping post appears not merely as a tool of pain, but as a carefully designed instrument of social engineering, orchestrated to teach, control, and entertain simultaneously. You probably won't survive noticing how the interplay of sight, sound, and social expectation turned a simple timber and rope into a complex instrument of civic life. You drift from the whipping post and spot a more peculiar spectacle. The pillory. Its wooden frame stands like a sentinel in the marketplace. Heavy beams with holes for the head and hands, a mechanical trap designed for humiliation more than injury. Mainstream sources describe it as a common punishment for petty crimes, debt, or moral transgressions, leaving the offender exposed to the elements and the judgment of neighbors. You probably won't survive imagining yourself trapped there, sun beating down, limbs immobilized, while townsfolk shout, jeer, and occasionally toss rotten food or dung in a ritualized chorus of correction. Historians still debate whether the pillory's main function was deterrent, punitive, or simply performative theater. The contraption is deceptively simple, yet effective. A hinged board that snaps closed, locking its victim in place. Fringe accounts suggest some towns decorated the pillory with inscriptions of past transgressions or even temporary signs of the offender's crime, like liar or thief, amplifying social shaming. You probably won't survive picturing children sneaking closer for a better look, learning early the consequences of disobedience, while adults murmur judgments that reinforce community norms. The sensory environment is striking. The rough wood chafing skin, the occasional sting of sunlight on sensitive flesh, the scent of the marketplace mingling with the odors of punishment, and the constant hum of gossip. Quirky anecdotes tell of townspeople bringing personal vendettas into play, throwing small objects, berries, eggs, or even mud, turning the pillory into an improvised community stage where morality and amusement blend seamlessly. Historians still argue whether this was a sanctioned form of communal participation or spontaneous embellishment. You notice the rhythm of justice unfolding in layers. First, the lawmaker's decree, then the officer's mechanical enforcement, followed by the audience's interpretation, and finally, the lingering social memory. Fringe sources hint that in some regions, pilloried individuals were given brief privileges to speak, explain, or even recite prayers, though the prevalence of this practice is debated. You probably won't survive thinking about the mixture of power, ritual, and social theater encapsulated in such a simple wooden frame. Even after release, the pillory leaves marks, both physical and psychological. The offender walks away, perhaps reddened, exhausted, and humiliated, but with a reputation indelibly imprinted in the collective memory of the town. Scholars still argue whether this lingering social effect was more impactful than the brief physical discomfort. You probably won't survive considering how a wooden frame, a few hours of exposure, and a crowd's attention could teach lessons that resonated far beyond the immediate punishment. As you step back, the pillory appears as a nexus of justice, morality, and entertainment, a tangible illustration of medieval priorities where shame, control, and societal cohesion intertwined in a single wooden apparatus. You probably won't survive realizing how cleverly these punishments leveraged human psychology, curiosity, and spectacle to shape behavior and maintain order. You continue along the cobbled streets and stumble upon a punishment even stranger: the ducking stool, reserved largely for scolding women, disorderly wives, or sometimes quarrelsome tavern-goers. Mainstream historical records show it involved a chair attached to a long wooden lever, swinging its occupant into water, typically a river or pond, often repeatedly. You probably won't survive imagining the terror as you teeter over the edge, water rising to meet you, the cold shock slicing through your body, while the crowd alternates between laughter and solemnity. Historians still argue whether repeated dunking was intended as physical correction, public humiliation, or a bizarre mix of both. The mechanics are fascinating. A lever arm lifts the chair, swinging it over the water's edge. Fringe accounts claim some communities timed the dunks with festivals, turning punishment into a morbid kind of entertainment. You probably won't survive picturing the spectators lining the banks, some waving, others throwing flowers or small stones, each gesture layering moral instruction and civic engagement. Sensory detail is unavoidable: the sharp smell of riverweed, the slap of water against wood and flesh, the creak of the lever, the shiver of anticipation, and the splashes echoing in the narrow alleys. Children laugh nervously while adults murmur approval or disapproval, and you probably won't survive noticing how deeply these communal rituals reinforce the boundaries of acceptable behavior. A quirky twist appears in historical anecdotes. Some victims, after multiple dunks, were considered cleansed of their moral or social offense, emerging with a peculiar sense of ritual rebirth, while others suffered lasting trauma. Historians still debate whether this cleansing was symbolic, functional, or purely anecdotal exaggeration. The psychological impact lingers. Once removed from the chair, victims often bear more than just wet clothes. They carry social shame, gossip, and sometimes grudges against the town itself. Fringe evidence suggests that occasional spectators would secretly assist or comfort the victim afterward. Subtle acts of rebellion against the rigid civic norms. You probably won't survive imagining how one simple device could blend physical fear, social performance, and moral instruction into a single unforgettable event. By the time you step away, the ducking stool is more than wood and water. It's a testament to the creativity, cruelty, and communal engagement of medieval justice. You probably won't survive realizing how the interplay of anticipation, humiliation, and spectacle taught lessons that were remembered long after the damp victim had shuffled away. As you meander past the ducking stool, the sound of clanking chains draws your attention to the stocks, a fixture both feared and fascinating in medieval towns. Mainstream records describe the stocks as low wooden frames with holes for ankles, sometimes wrists too, forcing the offender to sit or stand immobilized for hours, exposed to sun, wind, and the taunts of neighbors. You probably won't survive imagining yourself trapped there, legs aching, skin burning, insects buzzing, as the townspeople shuffle past, each step a reminder that your body and dignity are on public display. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the stocks was punitive, deterrent, or social theater designed to encourage moral conformity. The construction is deceptively simple. 2 horizontal beams, one movable to secure the ankles, often reinforced with iron rings. Fringe accounts tell of peculiar variations, like stocks on wheels for public processions, or ornate carvings of moral warnings etched into the wood. You probably won't survive picturing a parade of immobilized offenders rolled through the marketplace, a bizarre spectacle blending shame and instruction. Sensory impressions are vivid. The rough timber pressing into skin, the sting of nettles brushing ankles, the smell of mud and sweat mingling in the open air, the laughter of children, and the occasional hiss of annoyed adults. Quirky stories include townspeople tossing harmless items like peas or peasants' bread, while more mischievous onlookers reportedly use dripping honey to stick the soles of offenders' shoes to the cobbles. Historians still debate whether such embellishments were widespread tradition or localized eccentricities. Time in the stocks is instructive. As hours stretch and discomfort grows, you probably won't survive considering how this slow, stationary punishment cultivates reflection, sometimes penitence, sometimes defiance. Fringe accounts suggest that offenders might use the enforced immobility to gossip quietly, exchange secret messages, or even plan minor acts of revenge, though scholars remain uncertain about how common such behavior was. By the end of the day, the stocks leave a mark, not only physically but socially. The offender departs with sore muscles, reddened skin, and a lingering reputation, while the town has absorbed another lesson in conformity and obedience. You probably won't survive reflecting on how a simple wooden frame could orchestrate so many layers of sensory, social, and psychological engagement, turning a single moment of restraint into a deeply remembered civic experience. Further along the town's narrow lanes, you notice an even stranger contraption. The scold's bridle, a metal cage designed for the head, often with a gag to prevent speech. Mainstream historical accounts reveal it was primarily used on women accused of gossiping, nagging, or other disorderly behavior, forcing them into enforced silence while immobilized in public view. You probably won't survive picturing yourself trapped, the metal cold against your skin, the gag pressing uncomfortably as townsfolk lean close, whisper and point with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Historians still argue whether the bridle's main purpose was moral correction, social control, or sheer theatrical humiliation. The design is meticulous, a cage that envelops the head, sometimes with an iron tongue to prevent talking, straps securing it tightly, and intricate decorations that could indicate rank, crime, or local customs. Fringe sources claim that some versions had bells or whistles attached, turning the punished into walking instruments of warning, alerting the town to their transgressions. You probably won't survive imagining the soft jingle accompanying every staggered step, blending humiliation with a musical absurdity. Sensory impressions are unforgettable. The metallic taste of restraint, the smell of rust and leather, the dull ache of pressure points on your skull, and the persistent awareness of every curious gaze. Quirky anecdotes note that some offenders were provided tiny mirrors or charms within the bridle, perhaps to remind them of virtue or serve as ironic commentary. Historians still debate whether such inclusions were symbolic gestures, local quirks, or mythologized embellishments over time. The social lesson is layered. Even brief exposure marks the individual with shame, signaling to the community the price of transgression, while neighbors absorb the lesson passively or actively participate in commentary. Fringe accounts suggest that children sometimes reenacted the bridle in games, blending education, mockery, and imagination. You probably won't survive thinking about the subtle ways communal norms were reinforced through fear, spectacle, and inventive punishment. Once released, the psychological and social impacts linger. The offender departs with a new understanding of boundaries, while the town collectively reaffirms authority, etiquette, and morality. Historians still argue whether the scold's bridle functioned more as a preventative deterrent or a theatrical symbol of power. You probably won't survive realizing how this small, cruel device orchestrated such a complex interplay of pain, spectacle, and social pedagogy. You wander toward a quieter corner of the town, where the Iron Maiden looms like a twisted shrine. Mainstream historical sources indicate that this spiked coffin was a terrifying instrument of execution or extreme punishment, with iron spikes arranged to avoid instant death but inflict maximum agony over time. You probably won't survive picturing yourself inside, standing rigid, spikes pressing against flesh in a cruel geometry as the crowd gathers silently, some in fear, some in fascination. Historians still argue whether Iron Maidens were actually widely used in medieval Europe or largely a sensationalized invention of later storytellers. The construction is intricate, a tall, narrow iron case with interior spikes precisely positioned, hinges allowing it to open like a door, and a locking mechanism that ensured the prisoner could not escape. Fringe accounts suggest smaller versions existed as torture training tools or for intimidation without actual use. You probably won't survive imagining a town official demonstrating the device to visitors, claiming it was a deterrent while the offender shivered nearby, half visible, half imagined in the collective memory. The sensory environment is overwhelming, the cold bite of iron, the metallic scent of rust mixed with sweat, the low creak of hinges under tension, and the surreal silence of onlookers holding their breath. Quirky stories claim that some victims carried charms or talismans to ward off pain or death, though scholars debate whether these were effective superstitions or symbolic acts of defiance. You probably won't survive noticing how fear itself becomes part of the punishment, projected not just onto the victim, but absorbed by the crowd. This device also functions as psychological theater. Even the threat of the Iron Maiden could enforce obedience or elicit confessions. Fringe accounts suggest that townsfolk occasionally staged mock demonstrations with empty mannequins, heightening terror without actual harm. Historians still argue whether these practices were common, exaggerated, or entirely fictional. By the time you step back, the Iron Maiden represents more than mechanical cruelty. It embodies the medieval fusion of psychology, public performance, and social control. You probably won't survive realizing how a simple case of iron spikes could imprint fear into the minds of both offender and observer, shaping behavior as effectively as any law or sermon. As you stroll past the marketplace, you spot the pillory, a familiar yet still unnerving spectacle. Mainstream records describe it as a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, forcing the offender to stand immobilized, exposed to sun, rain, and the relentless scrutiny of passers-by. You probably won't survive imagining yourself trapped there, the hardwood digging into wrists, your neck pinned uncomfortably as curious townsfolk jeer, throw rotten vegetables, or offer mocking advice. Historians still argue whether the pillory's primary function was punishment, deterrence, or public shaming as civic theater. The engineering is simple but effective. Two horizontal beams hinge to allow the placement of head and hands, sometimes reinforced with iron, and occasionally adorned with the town's emblem or carved warnings. Fringe accounts describe pillories with bells or chained animals, turning them into theatrical statements of justice. You probably won't survive picturing a goat tethered nearby, bleeding as the crowd erupts in laughter, blending animal chaos with human humiliation. The sensory detail is vivid, the rough wood pressing against skin, the sting of sunburn or rain, the aroma of wet straw or nearby livestock, the buzz of insects, and the layered murmur of gossiping spectators. Quirky anecdotes note that townspeople occasionally wrote messages or drew sketches on the wooden boards, immortalizing the offender's predicament with art or mockery. Historians still debate how widespread such creative interactions actually were. Time in the pillory stretches painfully. Hours can feel like days. You probably won't survive considering the psychological endurance required as strangers poke, prod, or simply stare, transforming your body into a public lesson in compliance. Fringe evidence hints that offenders might have whispered secrets or traded small items with sympathetic onlookers, a subtle rebellion within enforced helplessness. By the end of the ordeal, the pillory has done its work. The offender is physically weary, socially marked, and psychologically imprinted with the town's authority. The community absorbs its own lesson in social boundaries, justice, and spectacle. You probably won't survive realizing how such a simple wooden device orchestrated the convergence of humiliation, pedagogy, and civic cohesion, turning one person's punishment into a shared experience for all. Beyond the pillory, you find yourself in front of the whipping post, its dark, weathered wood exuding centuries of pain. Mainstream accounts show that whipping was a common corporal punishment, often meted out for theft, insubordination, or moral transgression, leaving both physical and psychological scars. You probably won't survive picturing yourself tied, back arched, muscles tensing with each lash as the crowd murmurs, some in sympathy, others in grim satisfaction. Historians still argue whether whipping primarily aimed to reform, terrorize, or entertain the public. The structure is deceptively simple, a sturdy post anchored to the ground with chains or ropes, ensuring the offender's immobility. Fringe tales speak of whipping posts with engraved moral maxims, intended to remind the punished and observers of virtue and vice, or posts that doubled as town clocks, where each crack of the whip coincided with the toll of the hour. You probably won't survive imagining the rhythmic, almost ceremonial sound of leather striking skin, a grim drumbeat marking both time and transgression. Sensory impressions are acute. The sting of leather, the raw scent of sweat mingling with wood and dust, the sharp intake of breath from both the punished and the spectators, and the low murmur of anxious neighbors. Quirky anecdotes note that some townspeople would sprinkle sand or flour on the wounds afterward, claiming it would teach humility, though scholars debate whether this was practical medicine or symbolic ritual. Historians still argue whether whipping was more effective as physical correction or social spectacle. Time is elastic under the lash, each strike stretching minutes into what feels like eternity. You probably won't survive imagining the mental fortitude required, as the punished must endure both pain and the gaze of an audience, transforming physical suffering into a moral lesson. Fringe accounts suggest that some offenders whispered prayers, recited poetry, or even sang quietly to maintain composure, small acts of internal rebellion within enforced punishment. By the end of the session, the whipping post has achieved its dual purpose. The offender bears the physical and psychological imprint of correction, while the town witnesses justice, morality, and authority fused into a public, unforgettable display. You probably won't survive realizing how a simple post and lash could orchestrate such intricate intersections of pain, pedagogy, and communal ritual, leaving memories that linger far longer than the scars themselves. You wander past the whipping post and notice the ducking stool, wobbling slightly near the riverbank, its wooden seat and ropes promising a chilling ordeal. Mainstream historical records describe it as a punishment primarily for women accused of scolding, gossiping, or petty crimes, dunking them repeatedly into cold water as both penalty and public spectacle. You probably won't survive imagining yourself strapped in, the cold water shocking every nerve, the ropes creaking as townsfolk lean over to witness your involuntary immersion. Historians still argue whether the ducking stool's main function was punishment, moral correction, or community entertainment. The mechanics are elaborate yet straightforward. A hinged seat attached to a long wooden lever, allowing operators to dunk the occupant into the river or pond repeatedly. Fringe accounts suggest some ducking stools had small bells, turning each immersion into an audible spectacle, signaling to nearby villagers that justice or ridicule was in progress. You probably won't survive picturing the watery splashes mixing with shouts, laughter, and the occasional sympathetic groan, creating an aquatic theater of humiliation. Sensory impressions hit hard. The icy bite of water, the shock of wet clothing clinging to your skin, the musky aroma of riverbank reeds, the tension in the ropes, and the muffled splashes echoing in the quiet morning. Quirky anecdotes claim that some townspeople brought snacks or wagers, betting on how long the punished could endure, though historians debate whether gambling was commonplace or exaggerated by later storytellers. Time under the ducking stool stretches cruelly. Each dunk is a lesson in both endurance and social compliance. You probably won't survive imagining how mental strategies, breath control, prayer, or silent defiance became essential tools for survival within enforced submersion. Fringe accounts suggest some victims intentionally splashed water back at spectators as tiny rebellions, merging humor with resistance. By the time you are released from the dockside ordeal, the ducking stool has served its purpose, enforcing authority, creating a public spectacle, and embedding lessons of morality, endurance, and communal judgment into the minds of both the punished and the observers. You probably won't survive realizing how this simple lever, rope, and plank orchestrated such a multifaceted ritual of humiliation, fear, and psychological mastery over a small village population. As you trudge further through the village, your eyes land on the stocks, a device that seems deceptively mundane, yet carries centuries of social control. Mainstream historical records note that stocks were widely used for minor offenders, their legs, or sometimes hands and head, locked into a wooden frame, immobilizing them for hours or even days. You probably won't survive imagining yourself bent over, your legs pinioned, toes numb, as townsfolk stroll by, some sneering, some offering small acts of sympathy, like a piece of bread or a whispered word. Historians still argue whether stocks primarily functioned as a punitive measure or as a tool for public moral theater. The construction is precise, a horizontal plank with holes for limbs, sometimes reinforced with iron, mounted securely to withstand struggle and curious interference. Fringe accounts claim that some villages place decorative carvings or inscriptions on stocks, turning punishment into a form of folk art, reminding everyone that justice could be both functional and performative. You probably won't survive picturing your legs trapped, the splintered wood pressing into skin, the occasional insect crawling over exposed toes, as a tiny ecosystem of discomfort plays out in real time. Sensory detail saturates the scene. Rough timber biting your calves, the slight sway of the stalks under shifting weight, the murmur of observers exchanging gossip or moral commentary, the occasional clink of a coin tossed as charity, and the damp smell of the surrounding streets. Quirky stories tell of offenders doodling or carving initials into the wood, leaving traces of defiance or vanity, though historians debate how widespread this practice truly was. Time seems to fold into itself when trapped in the stocks. Minutes stretch interminably, punctuated only by the occasional sneeze, cough, or distant laughter. You probably won't survive imagining the mental gymnastics required to endure boredom, embarrassment, and the constant, unrelenting awareness of being the focal point of a small community's attention. Fringe anecdotes even suggest some townspeople whispered encouragement or recited jokes to distract the immobilized, creating a strangely intimate interplay between victim and spectators. By the time you are released, the stocks have left their mark. Physical discomfort paired with the social imprint of public correction. You probably won't survive recognizing how a simple frame of wood and iron could orchestrate endurance, shame, and community instruction simultaneously, making the stocks a quietly powerful instrument in the medieval toolkit of justice. You finally reach the shadowed square where the most peculiar punishments are reserved, the ones that linger in legend and imagination. Mainstream accounts highlight that medieval Europe often employed bizarre, sometimes humiliating rituals to enforce morality, from the scold's bridle to the cucking stool, all designed to leave an indelible impression on both offender and observer. You probably won't survive picturing a metal mask locking your tongue, with spikes grazing the inside, the heavy weight forcing your posture into awkwardness, while villagers gawk and whisper judgments. Historians still argue whether these punishments were more symbolic or intended for practical reform. The scold's bridle is engineered with unsettling ingenuity. Iron rings, a bit to restrain the tongue, and decorative engravings warning others of the consequences of gossip or impertinence. Fringe accounts describe it being used ceremoniously during festivals or processions, turning private correction into public theater. You probably won't survive imagining yourself paraded through the streets, mouth immobile, the clang of metal echoing against cobblestones as the crowd alternates between horror and amusement. The sensory tapestry is rich and unsettling, the cold bite of iron against skin, the faint metallic scent mixed with the earthy aroma of straw and livestock, the echo of footsteps and laughter off stone walls, the muffled protests forced into silence, and the uncomfortable awareness of being scrutinized from every angle. Quirky anecdotes recount that some punished women secretly inscribed messages on the interior of the bridle, small acts of personal defiance hidden from the world, though historians debate whether these stories are embellished lore or true acts of rebellion. Time under the bridle feels eternal. Each hour stretches into what seems like days as your mind oscillates between endurance and despair. You probably won't survive contemplating the psychological fortitude needed to maintain dignity, the mental strategies of distraction, prayer, or quiet defiance forming invisible shields against the oppressive gaze of the community. Fringe evidence suggests that some onlookers, perhaps sympathetic or mischievous, performed subtle gestures, hand signals, small offerings to ease the suffering or secretly communicate camaraderie. By the end, the bridle, the cucking stool, the stocks, and all other peculiar punishments converge in your memory as a testament to the medieval imagination of justice. Meticulous, theatrical, sometimes cruel, yet profoundly structured. You probably won't survive realizing how each object, each ritual, and each public act was carefully calibrated to educate, humiliate, and morally instruct, embedding societal norms into flesh, mind, and collective memory. Now, as you settle into a quiet corner of your mind, the echoes of wooden posts, cold rivers, and iron bristles begin to soften. The punishments, once so vivid and immediate, stretch into memory, their sharp edges dulled by the slow rhythm of your breathing. You feel the weight of centuries lifting off your shoulders as the sounds fade. No more the clatter of stocks, no more the sting of leather, no more the metallic bite of a scold's bridle. Instead, there is the gentle hum of time, the soft brushing of air over skin, and the sense that what you've witnessed is both distant and intimate. A tapestry of human creativity, fear, and morality that shaped entire communities. Imagine the cobblestones and riverbanks now empty, the stocks and stools silent, the town square bathed in a soft, forgiving light. You probably won't survive picturing how ordinary lives intertwined with extraordinary rituals, how communities navigated order, and how humans, even in their peculiar methods, sought to teach, to warn, and to endure. The absurdities mingle with lessons, forming an odd, gentle companionship between past and present, reminding you that the world has always been a mixture of discipline, theater, and human resilience. Breathe slowly. Let your mind linger on the quirks, the engraved stocks, the whispered messages, the splashes from the ducking stool, not as tools of cruelty, but as expressions of a society's struggle to instill morality, maintain order, and survive. You feel a sense of calm replacing tension, an awareness that these images are now stories, not realities, safe for reflection and curiosity. As your eyelids grow heavy, allow the textures, sounds, and faint scents of the medieval square to dissolve into soft, abstract memory. The villages, punishments, and rituals exist now only as gentle guides for thought, teaching endurance and perspective, humor and humanity. You probably won't survive carrying the vividness, but you can carry the lessons, the strange artistry, the social rhythm, the enduring creativity of human governance. Slowly, the world of medieval punishments recedes, leaving warmth, quiet reflection, and a gentle satisfaction. Let your breathing match the soft cadence of the narrative. Each inhale a reminder of curiosity, each exhale a release of tension. The past is distant, yet it whispers to your present, reassuring you that even the strangest punishments were part of the story that led to the world you know today.